As tensions rise around the world between powers such as the US and China, and with the invasion of Ukraine from Russia, a debate is growing about the role of Europe and more specifically the EU in all of these conflicts and global challenges, therefore raising questions about the formation of a European sovereign superstate. On one hand, some argue that the EU should play a more active role in international affairs and work to promote stability and cooperation. They point to the EU's history of successful conflict resolution and its commitment to upholding democratic values as reasons why it should take a more prominent role in international relations. These people also believe that EU federalization is an inevitable and necessary step for the EU. Others, however, argue that the EU should focus on its internal challenges and prioritize its own interests over those of other countries. They point to the difficulties that the EU has faced in recent years, such as the Eurozone crisis and the refugee crisis, as evidence that the EU should prioritize its own stability and unity rather than trying to play a larger role on the international stage, as tackling the world's issues is far too great of an ordeal when there are still problems at home. These people largely see it as a pipe dream that is unlikely to ever be realized. One of the main arguments in favor of EU federalization is that it would allow the EU to more effectively address challenges that cross national borders, such as climate change, terrorism, and economic crises. Taking the military as an example, overall, many Europeans have been in favor of having an EU army for some years now, and this view has only grown with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Piling resources and management together into one unitary structure is far more efficient than having several different armies collaborate on one problem. This would also give the EU an overall strong defense posture, as it would not be seen as many smaller armies unified into one, but rather one whole army tackling issues. Although the US has provided security for a while now for Europe, it would be better to rely less on it overall, as dependence on defense from one country is not a good long-term solution for Europe, even if doing all of this may cost significant amounts of money and resources. The benefits of jointly addressing crises is also an argument put in favor of federalization, as there would be greater coordination amongst all member states on the grounds of policymaking and decision-making. Central authority, with the power to directly implement measures and address specific issues through a coherent resolution, instead of many smaller ones, could potentially be more beneficial. However, at the same time, this also leads to a lack of flexibility, therefore limiting the effectiveness towards specific problems and needs for different regions. The major crises in the last decades for the EU, starting from the 2008 financial crisis to the refugee crisis, COVID, and consequently the Russian aggression in Eastern Europe, have seen different scales of measures and unity towards the problems. Some have been hailed as being very efficient and unified, such as the aids to Ukraine, whereas others have been a disaster for some countries, such as the recovery from the 2008 financial crisis. Countries including Greece, Spain, Ireland, Portugal, and Italy really struggled in their recovery from this due to a multitude of factors through having high levels of government debt and structural weaknesses among other problems. In the long run, setting up systems, preparing safety nets and resources well in advance of potential crises like these will minimize the effects that they can have on Europe, and if done correctly this can be very effective. However, if done in a hurried approach and incoherently, it can be damaging for some regions. It is important that mistakes are learned from, so better approaches to challenges can be done in the future. This will take time, but in the end, it will be well worth it. As time ripens all things, no man is born wise. Miguel de Cervantes. Vote is a party and movement that has emerged throughout Europe. It encourages more unity through the EU and is overall very pro-European collaboration. It very much envisions some of the ideals of a more federal Europe. Some of its aims include improving education and digitalization, enhancing competence of the EU's external relations, an innovative economy, citizen empowerment, and EU reform. They very much advocate for reform in some areas the EU struggles in, such as transparency and representation. Identifying these shows that there is still many areas that need reform. Nevertheless, this party's elections results throughout European countries and the European Parliament are still comparatively small to many other parties. This shows that although the debate is being held, when it comes to polls, people have shied away from voting for these parties in the last years. In contrast, there are also valid concerns about EU federalization. Many people worry that it could lead to a loss of national sovereignty and that it might not be democratically accountable to citizens. There are citizens within the EU that do not have a positive view of giving more national powers towards the EU and its bodies stationed around Brussels, Luxembourg, and other places. The term bureaucratic EU, among others, does not serve it well, giving it an image of differentiation between those in Brussels and those in the rest of Europe. Transparency throughout the EU, as supported by Vote, would help it clear questions about this image, as well as increasing average citizen involvement in EU matters that concern everyone, including boosting participation in EU Parliament elections. There are also concerns about the potential cost of EU federalization, both financially and in terms of time and resources required to implement it. This would involve increasing the supranational capacity to delegate tasks, to increasing research expenditure amongst many other activities that would require more money into the EU system. The more people and regions a system manages, the more resources and personnel it needs to manage it effectively. It is understandable that some people would find this a big problem, as this money would have to come from businesses and/or citizens and their wages, among other tax collecting methods. Also, Hungary's leader, Viktor Orbán, has been posing a big problem to the EU in the last years. Through his and his party's influence in the judiciary, this causes a lot of problems not just on a national level but on an EU one. His alliance with the party in power in Poland has caused issues when passing certain types of EU policy and decisions due to the EU system, as their consent is needed on a number of topics and processes. A solution to this problem is very complicated and has not been fully found yet. However, this is of big concern to the EU and solutions must be attempted if it is to stop happening. One big recent event that has not helped the federalization debate is that of the recent corruption scandal of members of the European Parliament receiving bribes in cash from Qatar. Millions of euros have been discovered in suitcases filled with banknotes around Brussels linked to the MEPs. Corruption, a word that was for some time not often associated with the EU and its institutions, is now being brought up more frequently. This event has been hailed by Eurosceptics, proving their discontent with the EU. Even after the years that have passed, showing the UK's problems that came with leaving the EU and reducing the platform for Eurosceptics, this event has revitalized it. If the EU wants to clean up its image after the event, transparency in meetings and their dealings will have to be a priority, as the public's trust has been broken. So, what does the future hold for EU federalization? It will depend on a variety of factors, including the views and priorities of member states and citizens, as well as the challenges and opportunities facing the EU in the coming years. If the future is to hold a promising vision towards EU federalization, the EU must learn from previous mistakes and work on them to refine its system if it wants to adapt to the changing international climate. However, if the EU does not refine itself by becoming more transparent, getting member state citizens more involved on an EU-wide level and learning from its mistakes, then the future is not going to look bright for EU federalization. Regardless of what the future holds, EU federalization is an important topic that deserves careful consideration and debate. Europe's increased influence in the world could be beneficial for the world as a whole if it is done correctly. Having another major big actor like a federalized Europe that incentivizes agreement could help counterbalance between major powers that are at each other's throats constantly. Overall, among the EU's countries that could have a great potential to adapt itself in a positive manner for the future is Spain, as Spain has seen itself change and reinvent itself since its admission into the EU and leaving behind its dictatorial past. Its citizens generally have a very positive view of the EU, with 72% of people seeing it favorably. However, it has suffered with some problems with its youth in the last decade. Watch this video here to find out why.